Okay, we're going to give you this quick profile on Robert Kennedy, and then we'll go from there, okay? Some of this you know we talked about, but you can write down what you think is important. Robert Francis Kennedy was born on November 20th, 1925, in Brookline, Massachusetts. Again, he was born on November 20th, 1925, in Brookline, Massachusetts. Anybody remember how many children Joseph Sr. and Rose Kennedy had? Anybody remember? How many? 9. And he was the 7th child of Joseph Sr. and Rose Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy was the 7th child of Joseph Sr. and Rose Kennedy. Now, when he was 4 years old, the Kennedy family moved from Massachusetts to New York. So he attended public elementary schools in New York, okay? A lot of people think that he spent his whole life in Massachusetts. He didn't. The Kennedy family, because of things they were doing, although they kept their house in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, moved to New York. So Bobby Kennedy attended public elementary schools in New York, but he was sent to a private high school. Okay, so he graduates from a private high school, which most of the Kennedy children did. So he attended public elementary schools in New York, but was sent to private high schools until he graduated. Before he went to college, he actually served briefly in the United States Navy. He underwent officer training in the Navy, but he was just in the Navy a very short period of time. And then he attended school at Harvard University. So after his graduation from a private high school, he served briefly in the United States Navy, went through officer training, and then enrolled at Harvard University. You know, as small as he was, and you've seen pictures of him, he actually was a pretty good football player, although Harvard did not have a great football team. But he was a 3-year letterman for the football team at Harvard, Bobby Kennedy was. And again, not a very big kid, but college athletics was just a little bit different in those days. But he did play football at Harvard, where he was a 3-year letterman for the team. After he graduated from Harvard University in 1948, he enrolled at the University of Virginia School of Law. So after his graduation from Harvard in 1948, he enrolled at the University of Virginia School of Law. Now it was there, this is kind of an interesting story, it was there at the University of Virginia School of Law that he met and eventually married his wife, Ethel Skakel. But the funny thing about Ethel Skakel is that Bobby was actually dating his sister for a period of time, and then got around Ethel and actually liked Ethel a little better, so I don't know who dumped who, but he ended up breaking up with Ethel's sister and ended up dating Ethel and marrying her. So I don't know how that sibling rivalry went the rest of their life, but that's what happened. He liked Ethel better than his sister, I guess. Well, what did he do? Anybody remember what he spent? You should might get. After he earned his law degree in 1951, what did he do in 1952? He didn't go get a job. You remember what he did? He always did this. Helping his brother. How did he help his brother? What did he do? He managed this very good. He managed his brother's successful 1952 Senate campaign. And once he worked very hard to get his brother elected to the United States Senate in 1952, then he began his legal career because he did go to law school to become a lawyer. So he graduates from the University of Virginia Law School. He spends the next period of time managing John F. Kennedy's 1952 successful senatorial campaign, and then he began his legal career. And his legal career, he became a lawyer for the Justice Department, okay, for the Department of Justice. And think about this time period in the 50s. What do you think his job is? To investigate what possible that there are possibly these in the United States. No, think about the, not so much spies. What are we afraid of at this time? Cold War, communism. Okay, so what he did is, his job was to investigate possible Soviet agents in the United States. That was his job with the Justice Department when he first started to work for him. Well, he had a pretty successful run for a short period of time with the Justice Department, so much so that they assigned him to a committee called the Senate Labor Rackets Committee. He assigned him to the Senate Labor Rackets Committee. So, and he served as chief counsel of the Senate Labor Rackets Committee from 1957 to 1959. So after investigating possible Soviet agents in the United States, Robert Kennedy then served as chief counsel for the Senate Labor Rackets Committee from 1957 through 59. What would that, anybody know what that means, Senate Rackets Committee? It's kind of an old term. They were investigating corruption, racketeering. Okay? Now, the man that Kennedy served under was John L. McClellan. That was his boss on the Senate Labor Rackets Committee. He was the chairman of the committee, John L. McClellan, and Bobby was kind of his right-hand man. And they started investigating corruption in different types of unions across the country. And there was one union in particular they were concerned about that they thought maybe had ties to the mafia. And do you know what union that was? That was headed up by the famous Jimmy Hoffa. You ever heard of Jimmy Hoffa? Teamsters Union. Okay? So Bobby Kennedy really began to dig deep into the Teamsters Union. What's the Teamsters Union do? Anybody know what that union still exists today? If you're a Teamster, you're a truck driver. You're hauling goods. Okay? And it's a very strong union in this country. And it was a very strong union in that day, but it had a lot of ties to the mafia and to organized crime. And Jimmy Hoffa was the head of the Teamsters Union. And so Bobby Kennedy basically butted heads and took on the president of the Teamsters Union, Jimmy Hoffa, which some people thought was kind of stupid because they had ties with who? That's where you get kind of the mafia thought process in this assassination of John Kennedy and even Robert Kennedy, because he ticked off the Teamsters Union when he went after Jimmy Hoffa. I don't think that has anything to do with any assassination, obviously, but that's what the stigma is. Well, Kennedy wasn't intimidated by Hoffa. He stood up to the president of the Teamsters Union. He pressed him on illegal activities that he felt Hoffa was involved in, and it got a little bit ugly. And it ended up that they really didn't get Hoffa for much, and Hoffa was very upset at Bobby Kennedy, hated Bobby Kennedy's guts, and a lot of people within the mafia hated Bobby Kennedy's guts. But they forgave him a little bit because remember John Kennedy's father, Joseph, dealt with those people in Chicago to help them elect their son. And then when John Kennedy supported Bobby Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy's efforts, and talked about that, then they thought, well, gee, we did all this work to get your son elected and you're turning on us. So that was another reason the mafia kind of gets involved in that possibility. Well, we all know that after he served the Justice Department, he became his brother's campaign manager again for the presidential election of 1960, which was also successful. And after that particular election, Bobby was then appointed Attorney General by his brother. I think we all remember that. Now, did Bobby remain as Attorney General long under President Johnson after his brother's assassination? No. There was bad blood between the two. We talked about some of that on the airplane home after the assassination. I mean, they didn't really like each other that much. Matter of fact, Bobby Kennedy was really trying to talk his brother into dropping Lyndon Johnson off the vice presidential ticket in the upcoming election of '64. So there was some bad blood there. So Bobby didn't spend much time. And what did Bobby do after leaving the Johnson cabinet, which he did serve for a brief period of time? Remember? He moved to New York to get residency and then ran successfully and won the Senate seat in New York. He defeated Kenneth Keating. And this was really kind of an upset because Kenneth Keating was the incumbent. In other words, he was running for re-election. And a lot of people that were supporters of Kenneth Keating were upset at Robert Kennedy because they didn't believe he was a real what? New Yorker, right. Yeah, because he had moved in there. So it was a little controversial, but he had the Kennedy name. So that Senate seat in New York was a very prestigious seat. And for him to go in there and defeat the incumbent candidate, Kenneth Keating, was pretty amazing. So, talking about, did he have a successful Senate career? Although it wasn't very long, he did do these 4 important things during the time that he was a senator from New York. So it wasn't just a worthless term for him. He actually did some very important things. So here are 4 things that Robert Kennedy did that were very important during the time he served in the United States Senate representing New York. 1, he started a very successful redevelopment project. He started a very successful redevelopment project in New York City. He started a successful redevelopment project in New York City. Think about that. What is a redevelopment project? Who does that deal with? What type of people? Poor, poverty-stricken people. So what he did is he redeveloped areas in New York City in which poor people lived to try to give them a better way of life. He was very much into that, okay? Second thing he did, and I think we've talked about, is during the time he served as Senator of New York, he continued to call for a halt in the further escalation of the Vietnam War. Okay, he spoke publicly as Senator of New York that we needed to halt and not further escalate the Vietnam War. So he wasn't so much speaking against the war as he was that we should not escalate it any farther, which means don't send what? More troops, okay? So he called for a halt in the further escalation of the Vietnam War. After he decided to run for president off the cuff, you know, that's when he started blasting the war effort, but not as a senator so much. He just said, let's not escalate. Third thing he did as Senator of New York is he worked very hard for all minorities, including African Americans. He worked very hard for all minorities, including African Americans. And probably his emphasis was on African Americans, simply because that was the thing that they were doing at the time. And the fourth thing he did, not only in New York, but all across the country, is he really committed himself to help the poor. He committed himself to help the poor. Now, when he made the decision to run for the presidency in 1968, many people and historians will tell you that they believe that there was no question that he would have not only won the Democratic nomination for the presidency, but more than likely would have been elected President of the United States. So on that fateful day of June 4th, 1968, the dreams of a Kennedy presidency really crushed the hopes of the Democratic Party. We'll talk about the election of 1968 when we get back from D.C. But it was unfortunate because Bobby Kennedy was well on his way to becoming President of the United States. I don't think there was any question about it. And an assassin's bullets ended his life and ended the Democratic Party as we know it for several years to come in elections, and led us in American history to a recession, led us to Watergate, led us to some real unsettling times in the country. So kind of go from there. Okay, that is the lecture. So what we're going to do again, just so you know, and these kids that are watching know, make sure you get through these notes. There's a review that's already posted on the website. Make sure you get that review. There will be 30 multiple choice questions on Wednesday. We'll report straight to the Commons on Wednesday. And Tuesday we'll be here and talk about things we need to do for the DC trip and watch a video on the Vietnam Wall. All right.